I buried my wife on a gray morning that felt heavier than the coffin itself. 42 years of marriage ended with a handful of dirt on polished wood and a crowd that slowly drifted away once the prayers were done. I stood there longer than anyone else, because when you lose someone who knew every version of you, walking away feels like a second death. My son didn't stay. He hugged me quickly, eyes already drifting toward his watch, and said, "Dad, we'll talk about everything later." Everything. Funny word. 2 days after the funeral, he came back, not to check on me, not to ask how I was sleeping, not to ask if I was eating, but to talk about property. Mom had the house in her name, he said, sitting in my living room like a guest waiting for a bill. We should probably start the paperwork. You're getting old. It'll be easier if I handle things. I didn't answer right away, because the night before the funeral, while I was still numb and shaking, my wife's lawyer had called me. She had left me something no one else knew about. A second house. A small, fully paid home on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but quiet, private, and legally mine alone. My wife had bought it years ago, just in case. In case of what? I had asked the lawyer. He paused before answering. She said, in case they show their true faces. So when my son asked about the estate, I simply said, "There's nothing to discuss yet." His jaw tightened. His wife, my daughter-in-law, didn't even hide her annoyance. For the next few weeks, they visited often. Too often. They brought groceries I didn't ask for, cleaned things I didn't want touched, and kept dropping hints. "You don't need all this space, Dad. You could live with us. That house could really help our kids' future." Not my future. Theirs. I stayed quiet. I signed nothing. I revealed nothing. 3 weeks later, the visits stopped. The calls stopped too. Then came the distance, cold, calculated, intentional. My son suddenly became busy. My messages went unanswered. On my birthday, I received a single text, "Hope you're okay." That's when I knew. I wasn't family anymore. I was an obstacle. So I moved, quietly. I packed my clothes, my photos, my grief, and left the main house exactly as it was. I drove to the second house my wife had left me, unlocked the door, and for the first time since her death, I slept, peacefully. 3 months passed, no calls, no visits, no concern. Then one evening my phone rang. My son. His voice was different, tight, rushed, nervous. "Dad, where are you?" I smiled for the first time in months. "I'm fine," I said. There was a pause. Then he exhaled sharply. "Dad, listen, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have pulled away. We were stressed. Things got complicated." Things, interesting choice of word. That's when his wife took the phone. Her tone was suddenly sweet, too sweet. "Please come back," she said. "The house feels empty without you. The kids miss their grandfather." I asked one simple question. "Why now?" Silence. Then the truth slipped out. They had taken loans, big ones. Used the house as assumed collateral. Promised money they didn't legally own yet. And now the bank was asking questions. They needed me back. They needed my signature. They needed what they thought I still had. So I went to see them. When I walked into my old house, their relief was obvious. My son smiled like a boy who thought he'd won. Papers were already on the table. "All we need is your approval," he said quickly. "Just a few signatures." I sat down calmly. Then I said, "There's something I should tell you." They leaned forward. "I don't live here anymore." Confusion flashed across their faces. "My wife left me another house," I continued. "It's in my name, fully paid. I moved there 3 months ago." My daughter-in-law's face drained of color. My son stood up. "What second house?" "The one she never trusted you to know about." Silence swallowed the room. I stood, picked up my coat, and added softly, "You stopped being my family the moment I became inconvenient." They begged, not metaphorically. They apologized. They cried. They promised things they should have done without being desperate. But it was too late. I left them standing in the house they wanted more than they ever wanted me. Now I live quietly. I garden. I read. I talk to my wife in the evenings and thank her for seeing what I couldn't. Revenge doesn't always come with shouting or destruction. Sometimes it comes from staying silent, watching people reveal themselves, and walking away with everything they thought they'd take from you. The days after my wife's funeral moved slowly, as if time itself was unsure how to behave without her. The house felt too large, every room echoing with memories that hadn't yet learned how to be quiet. Her slippers were still by the door, her favorite cup still sitting by the sink, and I couldn't bring myself to move anything. At night, I slept on my side of the bed, leaving her side untouched, convincing myself that if I stayed still enough, I might hear her breathing again. Grief has a strange way of making you believe impossible things. It was on the third night, when sleep refused to come, that my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another relative or neighbor calling to offer condolences I no longer had the energy to receive. But something in me answered anyway. The man on the other end introduced himself as my wife's lawyer. His voice was calm, professional, and painfully gentle, as if he already knew I was barely holding myself together. He told me my wife had asked him to contact me only after the funeral, only when things had settled enough for me to listen. He spoke about paperwork, about documents she had updated quietly over the years, and then he said something that made me sit up straight in the dark. My wife had left me another house. Not the one we lived in, not the one everyone knew about, but a small, fully paid property on the edge of town. It was entirely in my name. No shared ownership, no conditions, just mine. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. My wife had never mentioned anything like that, not once in all our years together. We shared everything, or so I had believed. When I asked why she would do something like that without telling me, the lawyer paused. He didn't rush to fill the silence, and in that pause, I felt my wife's presence more strongly than I had since she died. Finally, he told me the words she had left behind. She said it was for my safety, for my peace, and for the day I might need somewhere to go without asking anyone for permission. She had written, in her own careful handwriting, that people change when there is money involved, and that love is sometimes tested not by hardship, but by opportunity. I sat there for a long time after the call ended, staring at the wall as tears quietly soaked into my pillow. Part of me felt hurt that she had kept something so significant from me. Another part of me, the part that knew her better than anyone else, understood exactly why she had done it. My wife had always been observant, always watching people more closely than they realized. She noticed the way our son talked about the house like it was already his, the way his wife asked too many questions about documents and values. She never confronted them. She simply prepared. The next day, my son came over. He didn't ask me how I had slept or whether the nights were getting easier. He walked through the house with the confidence of someone who believed it belonged to him by default. He sat across from me and spoke about inheritance, about efficiency, about how, or at my age, it would be better if he handled things. I looked at him and saw a stranger wearing my son's face. In that moment, the lawyer's call echoed in my mind, and my wife's quiet wisdom suddenly felt painfully alive. I could have told him then. I could have said there was another house, that I wasn't as dependent as he seemed to think, that his plans were already incomplete. But something stopped me. Grief had stripped away my energy, but it had sharpened my clarity. I realized that telling the truth too early would only invite pressure, manipulation, and arguments I was too tired to fight. Silence felt safer. Silence felt like something my wife would have chosen. So I nodded, gave vague answers, and said I needed time. I watched his patience thin with each passing minute. I watched his wife's eyes move around the room, measuring, calculating. And in that moment, I understood the gift my wife had left me wasn't just a second house. It was knowledge. It was choice. It was the ability to wait and see who truly cared about me when they thought there was nothing more to gain. That night, alone again, in the quiet house, I whispered a thank you to my wife. Not just for the roof she had secured over my head, but for trusting me enough to let me discover the truth in my own time. Keeping quiet wasn't cowardice. It was respect for her foresight, for my dignity, and for the lessons she knew I would eventually need to learn. In the days that followed my wife's funeral, I expected grief to be the hardest thing to endure. I was wrong. Grief was heavy, yes, but it was honest. What hurt more was how quickly love in my own home began to feel conditional. My son returned 2 days after the burial, not with memories of his mother or stories meant to make me smile, but with a folder tucked under his arm and a seriousness that felt rehearsed. He sat across from me at the dining table, where his mother once served tea, and instead of asking how I was managing the silence, he cleared his throat and began talking about paperwork. He said things like, "We should be practical," and "It's better to plan early." His voice was calm, but there was an impatience underneath it, as if my sadness was an inconvenience delaying an important transaction. He spoke about the house in terms of value, not memories. He talked about ownership as though it were already decided, using words like, "when it's transferred," instead of "if." I listened quietly, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold, wondering how someone raised in this house could sound so unfamiliar inside it. His wife joined the conversation without hesitation. She leaned forward, smiling politely, and said how worried they were about me living alone. She suggested that managing such a large property would be stressful at my age. Her concern sounded kind on the surface, but it was delivered with the precision of someone making a case, not offering comfort. Every sentence felt like a step toward the same conclusion. The house would be easier for everyone if it wasn't really mine anymore. As they talked, small details began to stand out. My son didn't once mention his mother's belongings or what I might want to keep. His wife asked specific questions about documents, taxes, and market value, things no one should be thinking about while the scent of funeral flowers still lingered in the air. They spoke as though my role was to agree, to sign, to step aside gracefully. In their minds, I was already becoming a burden they were generously willing to manage. I found myself thinking back to all the years I had worked to keep this family together. I remembered late nights, missed vacations, sacrifices made quietly so my son could have opportunities I never did. I remembered my wife worrying about him, defending him, always believing that beneath his ambition was a good heart. Sitting there now, listening to him treat her life's home like an asset to be liquidated, I wondered what she would have thought if she could see him. I asked for time. Just time. The request seemed simple enough, but it immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. My son's jaw tightened. His wife exchanged a glance with him that lasted just a second too long. It was subtle, but I saw it. That look said this wasn't going according to plan. Their patience thinned, and the warmth in their voices cooled. They assured me there was no rush, but their body language told a different story. They had expected agreement, not hesitation. Over the next few weeks, their behavior confirmed what that first conversation had revealed. They visited often at first, bringing groceries I hadn't asked for and offering help I didn't need. But every visit circled back to the same topic: the house, the future, what would be best for everyone. Each time I delayed, the smiles grew tighter. The concern sounded more forced. The kindness began to feel like an obligation rather than genuine care. What hurt the most was realizing how quickly my grief was overlooked. There was no space for my mourning in their plans. My wife's absence wasn't something to be honored or respected. It was a gap to be filled, an opportunity to be acted upon. In their eyes, her death had created a problem to solve, not a loss to grieve. And the solution always seemed to involve me giving something up. One evening, after they left, I sat alone in the living room and looked around at the photographs on the walls. My wife smiling in the garden, my son as a child, standing proudly beside a bicycle we could barely afford at the time. I felt a deep, aching disappointment settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just the quiet realization that something fundamental had shifted. The love I thought was unconditional had revealed its limits. That was when I truly understood the warning hidden in my wife's final gift. She had seen this possibility long before I did. She had prepared for the moment when grief would make me vulnerable and others might see that vulnerability as leverage. Their early greed, masked as responsibility, showed me exactly who they were when they believed I had something they could take. And so I stayed silent. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. I watched, listened, and learned. Because once someone shows you their priorities, especially in moments that demand compassion, you can never unsee them. Expend 3 key point in 800-word, witter out any heading. Silence is often mistaken for weakness, but in those weeks after my wife's funeral, it became the strongest thing I had left. I had already seen enough to know that speaking too much would only give others more ways to twist my words, so I chose to say very little and listen instead. Every conversation with my son and his wife taught me something new, not because of what they asked, but because of how they reacted when I didn't give them what they wanted. At first, my silence seemed to confuse them. They were used to quick answers, to decisions made without resistance. When I responded to their questions about paperwork with vague phrases like, "we'll see," or "not yet," they smiled politely, but the smiles didn't reach their eyes. I could feel their patience being tested, even though they pretended to be understanding. They kept assuring me there was no rush, but their constant reminders betrayed them. People who truly aren't in a hurry don't keep checking the clock. I noticed how every visit followed the same pattern. They would start with small talk, asking about my health or commenting on the weather, but it never lasted long. Within minutes, the conversation would circle back to the same subject, like a needle stuck on a record. I never changed my response. I listened, nodded, and said I needed more time. Each time, their disappointment was a little harder to hide. The The more I stayed quiet, the more they revealed themselves. My son began to sigh loudly when I hesitated, as if my grief were an inconvenience. His wife started offering help that felt more like control, suggesting which bills she could manage for me, which rooms I no longer needed, even which furniture I should consider selling. I didn't argue. I didn't confront them. I simply declined, calmly and consistently. Silence, I learned, frustrates people who are used to power more than anger ever could. Weeks passed, and the tone of their visits shifted. The concern became thinner, the kindness more performative. When I didn't rush to sign anything, their patience slowly eroded. I could sense the calculation behind their words, the quiet question forming in their minds. What if he doesn't do what we expect? That uncertainty unsettled them far more than any refusal would have. What they didn't realize was that every moment of restraint on my part gave me clarity. By not defending myself or explaining my decisions, I removed myself from their expectations. I stopped trying to be understood and focused instead on understanding them. And what I understood was painful but necessary. Their affection had conditions. Their presence depended on progress toward their goals. As long as they believed there was something to gain, they stayed close. When there wasn't, they pulled away. The silence extended beyond words. I stopped calling first, I stopped reminding them of visits. I allowed gaps to form, and those gaps revealed how little effort they were willing to make without incentive. Days went by without a message. Then weeks. The phone stayed silent, except for the occasional half-hearted check, and that felt more like an obligation than concern. In that quiet, I began to heal in ways I hadn't expected. Without constant pressure, I could grieve my wife properly. I could sit with my memories without feeling rushed to move on or make decisions I wasn't ready for. The silence protected me. It gave me space to think, to remember who I was before I became someone others tried to manage. I also realized something important about power. People often think power comes from control or confrontation, but sometimes it comes from withholding access. By saying less, I took away their ability to steer the situation. I didn't give them anything to argue against, nothing to manipulate. My silence forced them to face their own intentions, and they didn't like what it revealed. As their visits became less frequent, the truth became impossible to ignore. When there was no immediate benefit to staying close, they drifted away. No dramatic arguments marked the change. No harsh words were exchanged, just absence. And that absence spoke louder than any confession ever could. In choosing silence, I hadn't planned revenge. I hadn't plotted outcomes. I simply protected myself. But in doing so, I allowed the truth to surface naturally. Silence stripped away pretense and left only reality behind. And once I saw that reality clearly, I knew exactly why my wife had trusted me with her secret. The change didn't happen all at once. There was no argument, no dramatic goodbye, no harsh words thrown across the room. Instead, it arrived quietly, in small absences that grew larger with time. At first, I didn't even notice it. I was still wrapped in my own grief, moving through the days like a man underwater, every sound muffled and distant. But slowly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The phone calls became shorter. Where my son once called every few days, now it was once a week, then once every 2 weeks. The conversations felt rushed, as though he had somewhere more important to be. He stopped asking how I was coping and began ending calls with quick excuses. "I'll call you later, Dad," he'd say. Later never came. I told myself not to take it personally, that people deal with loss in different ways. But deep down, I knew this wasn't grief. This was withdrawal. Visits followed the same path. At first, they came with groceries and polite concern. Then the groceries stopped, the concern faded. Eventually, the visits themselves became rare. When they did come, they stayed only briefly, standing instead of sitting, glancing at their phones, as if counting down the minutes. The house that once felt full of life when family visited now felt like a place they couldn't wait to leave. I noticed how their absence coincided perfectly with my refusal to sign anything. The more I delayed decisions about the house, the less present they became in my life. It was a cruel but clear equation. When there was no progress toward what they wanted, I stopped being a priority. I wasn't a father to be cared for anymore. I was an unresolved issue they preferred to avoid. Holidays came and went quietly. There was no invitation to dinner, no insistence that I join them. On my birthday, my phone buzzed once with a short message that felt more like a reminder than a celebration. No visit, no cake, no warmth. I sat alone at the kitchen table that evening, staring at a candle I hadn't bothered to light, and felt a kind of loneliness I had never known before. Losing my wife had hurt, but being emotionally discarded by my own child cut deeper. What made it worse was the clarity that came with time. In the silence they left behind, I began to see how conditional their affection had been. Their earlier kindness wasn't rooted in love or concern, it was fueled by expectation. Once that expectation stalled, so did their interest in me. The realization was bitter, but it stripped away any illusions I still held. I tried, once or twice, to reach out. Not to talk about property, not to discuss decisions, but simply to hear my son's voice. The calls went unanswered. Messages were read but not replied to. Each unanswered attempt felt like a door closing quietly in my face. I stopped trying after that. There's a certain dignity in recognizing when you are no longer wanted and choosing not to beg for attention. In their absence, I grieved more than just my wife. I grieved the son I thought I had, the family I believed would stand by me when I was at my most vulnerable. I questioned myself endlessly. Had I failed somewhere along the way? Had I raised him to value security over compassion? The questions had no answers, only echoes. And yet, as painful as the abandonment was, it brought with it an unexpected clarity. Without their constant presence, I could see the situation for what it truly was. Their silence was not accidental. It was a form of pressure, a way to punish me for not complying. By withdrawing emotionally, they hoped I would feel isolated enough to give in. They underestimated one thing: I had already survived the worst loss of my life. Their absence, as devastating as it felt, could not break me the way they expected. Over time, the hurt hardened into resolve. I stopped waiting for my phone to ring. I stopped imagining explanations for their behavior. I accepted the truth as it was, not as I wished it to be. The abandonment revealed their priorities more clearly than any argument ever could. When love became inconvenient, they walked away. That realization changed something inside me. It hurt deeply, but it also freed me. Because once you understand that someone's presence in your life depends on what you can provide, you also understand that their absence is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of theirs. The change didn't happen all at once. There was no argument, no dramatic goodbye, no harsh words thrown across the room. Instead, it arrived quietly, in small absences that grew larger with time. At first, I didn't even notice it. I was still wrapped in my own grief, moving through the days like a man underwater, every sound muffled and distant. But slowly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The phone calls became shorter. Where my son once called every few days, now it was once a week, then once every 2 weeks. The conversations felt rushed, as though he had somewhere more important to be. He stopped asking how I was coping and began ending calls with quick excuses. "I'll call you later, Dad," he'd say. Later never came. I told myself not to take it personally, that people deal with loss in different ways. But deep down I knew this wasn't grief. This was withdrawal. Visits followed the same path. At first, they came with groceries and polite concern. Then the groceries stopped. The concern faded. Eventually, the visits themselves became rare. When they did come, they stayed only briefly, standing instead of sitting, glancing at their phones as if counting down the minutes. The house that once felt full of life, when family visited, now felt like a place they couldn't wait to leave. I noticed how their absence coincided perfectly with my refusal to sign anything. The more I delayed decisions about the house, the less present they became in my life. It was a cruel but clear equation. When there was no progress toward what they wanted, I stopped being a priority. I wasn't a father to be cared for anymore. I was an unresolved issue they preferred to avoid. Holidays came and went quietly. There was no invitation to dinner, no insistence that I join them. On my birthday, my phone buzzed once with a short message that felt more like a reminder than a celebration. No visit, no cake, no warmth. I sat alone at the kitchen table that evening, staring at a candle I hadn't bothered to light, and felt a kind of loneliness I had never known before. Losing my wife had hurt, but being emotionally discarded by my own child cut deeper. What made it worse was the clarity that came with time. In the silence they left behind, I began to see how conditional their affection had been. Their earlier kindness wasn't rooted in love or concern. It was fueled by expectation. Once that expectation stalled, so did their interest in me. The realization was bitter, but it stripped away any illusions I still held. I tried, once or twice, to reach out. Not to talk about property, not to discuss decisions, but simply to hear my son's voice. The calls went unanswered. Messages were read but not replied to. Each unanswered attempt felt like a door closing quietly in my face. I stopped trying after that. There's a certain dignity in recognizing when you are no longer wanted and choosing not to beg for attention. In their absence, I grieved more than just my wife. I grieved the son I thought I had, the family I believed would stand by me when I was at my most vulnerable. I questioned myself endlessly. Had I failed somewhere along the way? Had I raised him to value security over compassion? The questions had no answers, only echoes. And yet, as painful as the abandonment was, it brought with it an unexpected clarity. Without their constant presence, I could see the situation for what it truly was. Their silence was not accidental. It was a form of pressure, a way to punish me for not complying. By withdrawing emotionally, they hoped I would feel isolated enough to give in. They underestimated one thing: I had already survived the worst loss of my life. Their absence, as devastating as it felt, could not break me the way they expected. Over time, the hurt hardened into resolve. I stopped waiting for my phone to ring. I stopped imagining explanations for their behavior. I accepted the truth as it was, not as I wished it to be. The abandonment revealed their priorities more clearly than any argument ever could. When love became inconvenient, they walked away. That realization changed something inside me. It hurt deeply, but it also freed me. Because once you understand that someone's presence in your life depends on what you can provide, you also understand that their absence is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of theirs. Expend 5 key point in 800-word letter out any heading. The decision to leave wasn't sudden, and it wasn't dramatic. There was no argument that pushed me out the door, no final phone call that made things clear. It came from a quiet understanding that settled into my bones after weeks of loneliness. I realized one morning, standing in the kitchen with a cup of tea I barely tasted, that I was living in a house filled with expectations that were no longer mine. Every wall seemed to whisper reminders of what others wanted from me, not what I needed to survive. I started preparing in small, careful ways. I didn't announce anything. I didn't ask for opinions. I packed slowly, a little each day, choosing only what mattered. Clothes first, then books, then the framed photographs that held my wife's smile frozen in happier times. I left behind furniture, dishes, decorations, things that had become symbols of a life others felt entitled to manage. What I carried with me were memories and the quiet promise my wife had left behind. The second house felt different the moment I unlocked the door. It was modest, nothing like the home I was leaving, but it felt honest. Sunlight filtered through the windows in the afternoon, and the rooms echoed not with pressure, but with possibility. I walked through each space slowly, imagining where things would go, imagining mornings without tension and nights without dread. For the first time since my wife's funeral, I felt something close to relief. I moved in without telling anyone. No farewell, no explanations. Just a clean break that felt necessary for my own sanity. In the old house, every sound reminded me of what I had lost and what others were waiting to take. In the new one, the silence felt healing rather than hollow. I slept deeply that first night, the kind of sleep that comes only when your mind finally believes it's safe. Days turned into weeks, and I settled into a routine that belonged entirely to me. I woke early, tended to a small garden my wife had once mentioned wanting someday, and spent evenings reading or simply sitting outside as the sky darkened. There was no one checking on me, no one pressuring me, and oddly enough, that absence felt like freedom. I wasn't lonely in the same way anymore. I was alone, yes, but on my own terms. What struck me most was how little I missed the old house. I had thought leaving it would feel like another loss, but it didn't. It felt like shedding a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. That house had become less about memories and more about leverage. Every room seemed to exist for someone else's future plans. Walking away from it was my way of reclaiming myself. I kept my move quiet for a reason. I wanted to see what would happen when I stopped being visible, when I stopped occupying the space others were watching. And just as I suspected, nothing happened at all. No calls, no messages, no concern. It confirmed what I had already come to understand: my presence in their lives had been tied to that house, not to who I was. From the safety of my new home, I looked back on everything with clearer eyes. The distance helped. It allowed me to separate grief from guilt, love from obligation. I wasn't running away. I was choosing peace. My wife had given me that option because she knew I might one day need a place untouched by expectation. Living there felt like honoring her foresight, like finally listening to the quiet wisdom she had tried to pass on. There were moments, of course, when sadness crept in. I missed the idea of family, the version of my son I once believed in. But even those moments were different now. They didn't break me. They reminded me why I had left. The quiet escape wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about survival. It was about choosing a life where I didn't have to justify my existence or my decisions. As the months passed, I grew stronger in ways I hadn't anticipated. I learned that independence doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from letting go. The second house wasn't just a roof over my head. It was a boundary, a statement, a place where I could live without being measured by what I owned or what I could give away. In that quiet space, I finally understood the full weight of my wife's gift. She hadn't just left me a house. She had left me an exit, a way out before the pressure turned into regret. And every peaceful night I spent there confirmed one simple truth: leaving silently was the bravest decision I had made in a long time. 3 months after I moved away, my phone rang in the early evening, just as the sun was slipping behind the trees outside my new home. I recognized my son's name on the screen instantly. It had been so long since he last called that for a moment I simply stared at it, letting it ring. The silence of the house felt steady, protective, as if it were reminding me of everything I had built for myself in his absence. When I finally answered, his voice sounded unfamiliar, tight, hurried, edged with a nervousness I had never heard from him before. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask where I had been all this time. Instead, he went straight to the point, asking where I was and why I hadn't been home. The word home stung, because I knew what he really meant. He wasn't worried about my well-being. He was worried about access. I told him calmly that I was fine and that I had moved. There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to hear his breathing change. That was when his wife took the phone. Her voice was suddenly warm, almost gentle, so different from the sharp efficiency she used to speak with. She said they had been thinking about me, that the house felt empty without me, that the children missed their grandfather. Every word sounded carefully chosen, polished to produce the right emotional response. I listened without interrupting, letting her finish. When she finally stopped, I asked a simple question: why now? The silence that followed told me everything before she even spoke. Eventually, the truth emerged in pieces. They were under pressure. They had made financial decisions assuming things would go their way. Loans had been taken. Promises had been made. The house they thought they would soon control had been used as reassurance, if not outright collateral. Now deadlines were approaching, and suddenly I mattered again. They asked me to come back, not as a father in need of care, but as a solution to a problem they had created. I agreed to visit, more out of curiosity than obligation. When I walked into the old house, I felt strangely detached, like a guest in a place that no longer belonged to me. Papers were already laid out on the table, pens placed neatly beside them. My son smiled with visible relief, as though my presence alone had solved everything. They talked quickly, explaining what they needed, how little time there was, how everything would be fine once I signed. I let them speak, the way I had learned to do in silence. When they finally looked at me expectantly, I told them the truth. I told them about the second house, about how it was fully mine, about how I had been living there for months in peace. The color drained from their faces in a way that no argument ever could have caused. My son stood up abruptly, anger and disbelief flashing across his face. His wife said nothing at all. I continued, calmly, explaining that I had no intention of returning or signing anything. I reminded them that when I needed family the most, they chose distance. Now that they needed something from me, they remembered how to be kind. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. They apologized, they begged. They promised things that should never require desperation to be offered. I listened, but my heart didn't move the way it once might have. Something fundamental had changed during those quiet months alone. I had learned the difference between love and convenience. I had learned that being needed is not the same as being valued. I left without signing a single paper. Walking out of that house felt lighter than I expected, as if I were finally closing a door that had been left ajar for too long. I didn't feel triumphant or cruel. I felt resolved. Karma hadn't arrived with anger or revenge. It had arrived with clarity. Back in my own home, as the evening settled around me, I thought about my wife and the foresight she had shown. She had trusted silence, patience, and truth to do what confrontation never could. In the end, I didn't have to raise my voice or demand respect. I simply lived my life without compromising my dignity. They had begged me back, hoping to reclaim control. Instead, they were left facing the consequences of their choices. And I, for the first time in a long while, felt truly at peace, not because I had won, but because I had finally chosen myself.